So my talk time is around 30 minutes, and so that just so we know that I clock in around that time. And I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse to go first in our auspicious, wonderful 2 days together, but I am taking it as a blessing. And you know, there's a lot of different ways to approach the idea of the sacred masculine and feminine, along with those accompanying ideas of the polarity and the duality. And I think that you can see by the title of my presentation today that I'm really kind of going in on the polarity facet of things. And as to the masculine and feminine, I decided not to treat it literally in terms of like gender and sex, but instead I'm using it as a metaphor as regards life and nature. I recently read Robert Bella's book. He's an American religious sociologist. His book, Religion in Human Evolution from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age. And he states in the book how human civilizations, most societies, are very oppressive to at least a significant portion of their populations, often women. And, you know, he says the exception are the hunter-gatherers, but even there's the caveat that it's probably a lot better to be an adult male than it is to be either a woman or a child. And so, you know, I'm interested, as per Gebser, in integral consciousness that supersedes dualism and also works to overcome the kind of patriarchal weight and confines that we find ourselves in with deficient mental consciousness. And so this idea of an embrace of the masculine and the feminine and the dark and the light, as well as the active and the receptive. So I thought I'd open with this painting by Vincent van Gogh. I saw it recently. It's called Farmhouse in Provence. It was painted in 1888. And the reason that I'm showing it is because it reminds me, and I think so many of Van Gogh's paintings do this, of what William James referred to as pure experience. And that's the organic flux of life before reflection has categorized it. And I think that's what Vincent van Gogh does, so that when we look at one of his paintings, we're not seeing, you know, a flat depiction of fields and flowers and houses, but we're actually seeing it through his heart, mind, and soul, and it's got chi and energy and spirit going through all of it. And so, you know, this is a way of seeing into the world. It's a way of seeing form and matter, masculine and feminine, yin and yang, or as Samuel Taylor Coleridge would describe it, as two forces of one power. And that's what we're going to be looking at today and exploring together. So, you know, as we all know, Gebser identified mental consciousness breaking through around 500 BC in Greece, but then he specifies how there was this real breach with polarity that happened in the Renaissance. And, you know, he says in the Renaissance, as perspective fixed the observer and the observed, that's when that breach really came about. And he says it fixes man on the one hand and the world on the other. Compelled to emphasize his ego ever more strongly because of the isolating fixity, man faces the world in hostile confrontation. So it was around the 17th century that the idea of consciousness started coming into being. Consciousness that was a personalized state that wasn't necessarily connected with the moral or ethical matters. And so we had the seeds of it planted by Descartes with the split of mind-body. And then John Locke took it a bit further, where he started seeing consciousness as an actual thing. And he coined the neologism self-consciousness. So we have that subjectivism starting to come in, as well as, you know, this view of the world and the universe as being kind of clock-like and mechanistic, that needed to be divided into parts in order to understand it. And then also science kicks in as a trial way to find truth, and we have Francis Bacon, the father of imperialism, who said things like, we're going to torture nature to get our secrets out of her, you know, which is echoed in William Wordsworth, The Table Turned, about 100 years later, when he writes, Sweet is the lore which nature brings, our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things we murder to dissect. So, in looking at this historically, there's been quite a few scholars and visionaries who really abhorred this bifurcation of nature and this objectification. And one of these people who I'm going to focus in on today is Charles Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And I chose him because he does wonderful things with imagination and also in his conversations and thoughts about polarity. So, he was, from his earliest years, was in touch with metaphysical and cosmic thoughts, and you can kind of put it all into perspective. So when he was about 9 years old, Frederick William Herschel discovered Uranus and was writing things about an evolving universe. He said, quote, "A living, growing, organic entity with all nebulae belonging to one enormous extended family." And, I read this one book, and Coleridge and his dad at that time, who was still alive, they would have conversations. His father was really into the cosmos, and they would have conversations about that. So in school, Coleridge was exposed to Greek classics, the poetry of Milton and Shakespeare, as well as philosophical and religious thought. And we always think of him today, I think, as being a romantic poet. But Owen Barfield, who's an English philosopher, in his book, What Coleridge Thought, which much of this presentation is based on, really talks about him as being a prescient thinker for modernity. So that's what we're going to be exploring. Now Coleridge, in his day, he moved in circles of all the scholars and visionaries of the time, many of whom had adopted the dualistic view of things and this kind of mechanistic worldview. And Coleridge, in particular, really abhorred the materialist who said that matter has no inward. Because for Coleridge, acknowledging the living nature of life was his entire raison d'etre. So he looked at Natura, Natarans, or life, or Naturgeist, or vis naturan, not as some kind of an abstraction, but something that was completely real. It was super sensuous, and something real that fell outside of the despotism of the eye. And so it was the principle of existence for both organic and inorganic phenomena, and he spoke of how everything is in a perpetual state of transformation, motion, and change. And so he saw it as a law or a power, the essence of which was its inwardness, the outwardness being its effect and mode of manifesting itself. And he felt that it presented in nature as the productive power suspended and quenched in the product. So this is where polarity comes in, because this whole idea of Natarata, which is form, and Nataran, which is that which is moving through, is the polarity and the dynamic relationship between inward and outward. So it's on the outward side, or on the inward side, its energy is potential or free energy, and on the outward side, its energy as structure or form. And he felt that it was not a composite force, but two forms in which one power works in the same act and instant. And he felt that the apprehension of polarity is in itself the basic act of imagination. So, thinking of like a symbol that would bring this to life is the yin-yang symbol. And, and I'm well aware that Gebser uses the yin-yang symbol to talk about the polarity found in mythical consciousness. But what I am proposing and offering forth is that we look at it with a slight spin and present it as representative of all life, from quantum to cosmos, organic to inorganic, and from nature to culture. And so I was able to find this beautiful little video clip from the Resonance Science Foundation that portrays yin-yang not as a flat two-dimensional idea, but as something that is spheric and rotating, as Gebser would think about integral consciousness, with both facets of the yin and the yang infiltrating all the way through. So, two forces, one power. And, thinking about Gebser and integral consciousness, let me see if I can say this right. So that there's this, with integral, there's this awareing or this integration of a whole of the unperspectival and the perspectival, as well as his idea of the spiritual being in the world and the world being in spirit. And so all of which is the perceived presence which then imparts truth and veritas. So it is this ongoing undulating of these energies, which I think is very similar to our Natarans, Natura. So let's talk about imagination for just a moment. So in the Bibliographia Literaria of Coleridge, he writes there that he recognized imagination for this first time in school when he was reading poems and sonnets, and he felt that they had this great reconciliation of heart and mind. And he felt that the imagination was in two forms, primary imagination and secondary imagination. And so primary imagination he saw as being the unconscious backdrop of the living power and prime agent of perception. It was eternal, infinite act of creation, primordial and supersensuous. And as such, he felt that it could only be witnessed in the familiar face of nature herself. Now, secondary imagination is an echo of primary, coexisting with the conscious will. It's a dynamic force but elusive, and it's primary imagination's progeny that is manifested via symbol, sound, and metaphor, and it channels its beauty to earth through human consciousness via art, poetry, and music. You know, sidebar, Ian McGilchrist also talks of this in his book when he talks about music. So primary music would be the birds and the sounds of nature, and secondary music would be people in rock bands playing together, or Bach or Beethoven. So just to kind of bring that in there too. So with the secondary imagination, he also, this is an important idea to bring in, he saw that there were two principles that it also encompassed. One was unity and multeity, and so this is the universal and the many. And we could think of it as, you know, a Shakespearean character who is presented to as every man, or how there's an emotion presented in poetry that we all can identify with and feel. And as part of that, it also includes the relationship between the whole and the parts, or totus in omni parte, so the whole in every part. And it's this idea that each part is a whole, almost kind of holographic in nature, but yet is imperative to the creation of a greater whole. And then the second principle is that imagination facilitates an ability to become a polar unity of self and world, or mind and nature, that both and, that activates imagination. Okay, so now we're going to dig into his model, and this is a way to kind of understand his thinking around how to step beyond the bifurcation of nature and the dualism, and this kind of Cartesian dualism that he was presented with in his lifetime. And he refers to it as, let me get there, the order of mental powers model. And I would kind of like to reframe it as the order of consciousness model. And, in looking at it, I thought, well, we can unstack it. And in a Gebserian kind of term, think of all that moving to the left as being the unperspectival, and all that moving to the right as being the perspectival. But, I know, you guys are such Gebserian scholars that you're going to look at this and go, wait a minute, reason and fancy should be flipped the other way. But what we're going to talk about, and what I would like to present, is that he often talks about sense in kind of a deficient mental consciousness way, in terms of that it falls under the despotism of the eye, so that anything that we can't see isn't believed or isn't real. And then the way that he talks about reason, he gives it a very distinct kind of definition, and it's closer to the ever-present origin or the archaic source. So, we're gonna talk through all this just by kind of breaking it apart. The plan for the presentation is I'm gonna break it apart so we can see how it works, and then we're gonna apply it to some real-world context and modernity to see how it plays out. And I sort of see it as being like, Gebser lays out this great frame for integral consciousness, and some of these thoughts of Coleridge actually help us to kind of activate it and bring it to life. So I see them intermingling in that way. All right, so here's the model. So first of all, everything is in polarity. So the upper half of the model is interrelated, the inner energies. The lower half of the model are the outer energies. And then everything within it is also in polar relation. So reason and sense, imagination and fancy, and then this Janus-based nature of understanding. So just very quickly, it looks like the model is deceptive, right? Because it looks like reason and sense are very far from each other, but they're polar related. So they're like octaves of the same melody. And so that also means that reason is closer to sense than it is to understanding. Coleridge writes of this, he explains, reason is a direct aspect and inward beholding, having a similar relation to the intelligible or spiritual as sense has to the outer material or phenomenal. And the other thing about reason and sense is that then that also means that mind and body are connected. As Coleridge writes, deep thinking is attainable only by a man of deep feeling. So let's start and just take a look at reason and sense. So he sees sense as being passive in that it's the passive perception of things, with the polar extreme being reason, which is active and of the inner realm. And reason, we have to think of it very completely, very differently. It's not at all connected to understanding. It's very different than understanding in his terms. So that humans are able to take in reason by dreaming and waking. It's super sensuous. It's incredibly individual. It's refracted through each person very differently, but at the same time it's also universal in that we all have it. And he described it as the unconscious. And you have to remember, we're around 1817, so we're way before Jung, we're way before Freud. But he sees it as unconscious, and as such, then we need to have contemplation and reflection in order to behold it and in order to open to its ideas. It also has an element of the divine in it. It's the light of Logos. It's the God that shines through each and every one of us. And it's also the ground and source of all ideas that are presented in symbol form, so therefore the understanding can't touch it directly. It has to be interpreted, often through imagination. So let's look at understanding. It's got this Janus facet to it, two-faced. And so one half is on the side of reason, one half is on the side of sense. And so when we look at the lower one that is unirradiated by reason, we use that word like you can think of the sun radiating down on it. So it's unirradiated by reason, and so it becomes animal inference, instinct, and inherited traits. So you can think of it as the kind of understanding that if you touch a hot stove, you pull your hand away. It's also, when it's unirradiated by reason, it tends to fall under the despotism of the eye, which then means anything that it can't see, literally believes doesn't exist. And then that also takes it into kind of hypotheticals of fancy or things that may or may not be true. And then it's also capable of abstractionism. I kind of already said this point, but it turns back on itself and it looks for explanations of things even if they don't make sense. And then finally, we can think of it as how McGilchrist talks about the left and right hemispheres of the brain. So the left hemisphere of the brain tends to revision reality. It's like a step removed from reality, but think it has the entire picture. And then understanding irradiated by reason, then is when we have those true insights and those kind of eureka moments. And it also can include a body sensing too. It's like something suddenly clicks and we're like, oh, I got it, now I understand it. Like that is that kind of understanding. And it also, it's a kind of where that reason and imagination, they come down and they activate something in our mind's eye, that we get it. So let's just look real quick at imagination and fancy. We've already talked about imagination, so it's that both-and sense that activates it. It's active and dynamic. It apprehends dynamicism or polarity. It's unity and multiety. So imagination, pure imagination, it knows itself in the object that it's focused on. And it's highly connected to reason, as we already saw. And it's also got this other facet, because it's the both-and, it also has negative capability, and that there's transformation by being able to hold negative capability. You know, as we see later coming about in Jung's teachings of individuation. And I just wanted to cite this quote from John Keats in 1817, same year as the Bibliographia. I mean, negative capability, that is when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without an irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. And then fancy, being the polar pair to imagination. So while imagination has this kind of harmony of its both and, fantasy has an undue predominance of centripetal force that seeks to find itself by objectizing everything around it. So it's more, oops, sorry, hit the wrong button. Oh gosh. All right, let me just get us through this. All right, we're gonna come back. I like this centripetal thing. I had to look it up, you know, centrifugal versus centripetal, and centripetal is like where you're standing in the middle and you're twirling something around you. So it's like you're the center and you objectize everything that's out around you. So self-other, either or kind of orientation. And, you know, just as we talked about understanding that's unirradiated by reason, it seeks content to make sense out of the world, and as such can confuse speculation with empiricism, and it can have a belief in the absurd. So, pull this quote from Daniel Kahneman, who's an experimental psychologist, who wrote, "People can maintain an unshakable faith in any proposition, however absurd, when they're sustained by a community of like-minded believers." All right, so for the close of the presentation, I thought that what we could do is take a look at the model in light of 4 different contexts, and we're going to start with business. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 businesses. The first is going to be one that I believe is kind of an integral consciousness kind of business, and it really circles throughout all of the model. And then we're going to look at a second business that seems to be bifurcated down into the lower half of the model. So let me just get my notes here so that I don't mess up. All right, so we're going to start, our first business is going to be Chobani Yogurt, and its CEO, Hamdi Ulukaya. And so he tells in a TED Talk how he came to buy this yogurt factory. So he gets a flyer in the mail that says, "Oh, upstate New York, there's a yogurt factory for sale." He looks at it and throws it in the trash. And then the next day he's called to pull it out, which I think is that would be an example of understanding irradiated by reason. And then he's able to have negative capability, because when he drives, he's got a negative capacity. When he drives to go see it, when he approaches where the plant is, there's a sign that says dead end. And the price of the yogurt factory is priced so low that he says, God, obviously the owner said this place is completely worthless. And then his lawyer reminds him that he has no money and no experience, right? So you know, we can think of it using this model. It's sort of like Natura. It's like a dead shell. It's like dead, gone. But he goes and he visits it, and while he's there, there's 55 remaining employees, and they are closing down the plant, and he says that they do it in complete silence with grace. And it's from seeing them, so that's sort of the Natarans moving through the shell, and he decides based on that to go ahead and buy it. And then he does all kinds of things which other businesses might consider to be absurd or fancy or falling purely under the despotism of the eye. He never falls under that, but he embraces a full body sensing and imagination irradiated by reason. So he hires immigrants and refugees, as well as transport and translators for them. He creates jobs and gives employees partial ownership in the company. Many facets of the business include philanthropy. He supports local communities, school children, and veterans, and the company thrives. And their mission statement is do well by doing good. So we've got that dynamicism of Natura to Natarans. Now, our second example is going to be OpenAI Chat GPT. And I don't choose it, you know, I have lots of feelings about AI, but I don't really choose it for that. But it's such a good example of this. So I don't know if you remember, but last November, Sam Altman was ousted as the CEO, and then the board, and he was brought back in, and people from the board were let go, and all of this. So I went in at that time in November and pulled their mission statement on their website, which was to build artificial general intelligence that is safe and benefits all of humanity. And then they had a structure that was directed into 2 arms, a non-profit board whose beneficiary is humanity, and a for-profit subsidiary funded by Microsoft and venture capital firms. So what seems to be going on here is that we've got in our model kind of a dynamicism where these two things are being pulled apart. So we've got one half which is understanding infused by reason, which might be the beneficiary of humanity. And then on the lower half, this kind of fantasy infused, let's make lots of money, which they're probably going to do, on the lower half. And so, the question is, how is this all going to go? It seems like there's just being lip service given to the upper half, and they're really focused on the lower half. And I think I read recently that they're thinking about splitting the company in two so that they can probably step beyond that. So our next context is activism. And I wanted to share with you Joanna Macy's The Work That Reconnects. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it is a process that she describes as it is a transition from a doomed economy of industrial growth to a life-sustaining society committed to the recovery of the world. And so and I'm showing it here. These are the 4 steps of the process. It is a process. It's an ongoing, you live it. It's a life-lived process. And it starts with this gratitude, which is a very much a Coleridgean thought. So here the gratitude is, doing a meditation every day where you note what you're grateful for. And, this is the same thing that Coleridge talked about in terms of meditation or reflection in order to open us to the possibility of beholding the reason that wants to shine forth. It also holds negative capability. The next step in her model is honoring our pain for the world. And the intention of it is that which is negative and difficult, that we are able to hold it and to be able to be with the pain. And it's sort of from that both and holding that we see with new eyes, which are eyes irradiated by reason, as Coleridge would say. And then it also speaks to dynamic action and lived experience. So she gives many examples of how to do this, both collectively and personally, to actually make a change in the world. Okay, so we had to do art. We have to do art because Coleridge, is a poet, and so we've got that facet of his creativity, but then we've also got AI, which you can generate a picture like I did right with this one here, just with kind of the click of a keystroke. You can do movies that way now. Someone even showed me that you can create a podcast just by doing the same thing. So it's really kind of rampant. So I thought what I would do is to explore this issue that I would pick a piece of art, which I think is a really good example of secondary imagination. And so I chose Pablo Picasso's Card Player. And so I chose it, like one of the things that goes on with it, it has this unity and multiety going on. So we see that each one of the parts in it, they're whole in and of themselves, but they're completely necessary for the aesthetic of the painting. And it lures us in. It kind of pulls us in, and it also engages our imagination should we choose to engage with it. So when I engage with it, with my imagination, I see a card player, and he's sitting in a room with fleur-de-lis and this kind of Greco wallpaper, and he's holding his cards really close to his chest. Now, I can also go inside the card player, and I'm sitting there and I see someone sitting across the table from me, and I've also got side glances at the people next to me. And then it also gives me a sense of the setting, right? So there maybe are these stairs that I have to climb up to get there, and I maybe need a special pass to get in. And it feels to me very kind of dark and bohemian. I kind of imagine a room that's smoke-filled, right? So here we have this flat pane, but it's very activating. Like we can do all kinds of things with it. Now, let's compare that with these AI-generated replicant Picasso paintings. So some students at a school, they took hundreds of online images of Picasso and programmed into a neural net. And I'm just speaking on my judgment, but what they do for me, I don't feel the same kind of lure. They feel sort of flat and kind of falsely digitized. And so they seem to me more that they're the product of unirradiated fancy than reason-infused imagination. So they're kind of flat. But then the question is, what about this installation at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is Rafik Anadol's unsupervised machine hallucinations? And I'm showing you this. This was on a wall a huge wall, like a person versus this would be like this high. So it's this giant thing that's going on. And so the artist took 200 years of art from Moma's collection and programmed AI to, quote, interpret and transform the museum's data set to create new forms that could exist in the archive but don't. So it's dynamic, it's creating, and so despite its ability to mesmerize, and I think it is mesmerizing, the question for me is, does it lend any kind of inner meaning? You know, it's just sort of like, it's like fancy, you know, it's fancy. All right, and so then I thought we could close with environmentalism, just to kind of close on nature where we started. And, you know, there is a movement afoot where the naturing and a sense of nature, I believe, is starting to grow. And it's sort of as if we've got that octave melody between reason and sense that are resonating a bit more and informing one another. And so I'm referring to, there was a recent article in the New York Times called Nature Lawyers Up, and the idea is that more and more nature is not only, there are some who are not only trying to protect nature, but are actually stating that it has legal rights. And there's quite an international list. There's a website called the Rights of Nature Law Library that has cases throughout, and they're even starting to look at the moon, because, you know, we're going to go to the moon and we're going to trash the moon in the same way that we've trashed Earth. So they're already starting to thinking about the protection of the moon. And so in this New York Times article, the woman who wrote it, I mean, it is starting to spread out. And I just want to say that it seems to be in locations where people in Coleridgean terms have understanding irradiated by reason and imagination. The author writes, it's about how we think of the natural world, how we feel about it. It's not a coincidence that these laws have caught on so much more deeply in countries such as Ecuador and Bolivia, where indigenous nations and communities have a spiritual relationship with nature and see themselves as part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Time for questions.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'll do a few minutes for questions. Great. Yes.
It's not a question, just when you were talking about centripetal, it's a vocal.
Yes.
So it has that same kind of energy and centralized.
Right. That's great. Yeah. Yes.
When I was looking at all of this AI generated whatever, it came to me that they all lacked heart.
Yes, they lack heart. I mean, it seems like whenever I see AI generated stuff, immediately, even though it looks, okay, but it doesn't, I can't feel anything.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree, totally. Yes.
Yes, I also have a comment, I guess, when I heard you speaking about, I guess I pronounce it centripetal force.
Yeah.
When we actually place ourselves in the center, especially when we presence the here and now, like say in a meditation pose, for example, and we close our eyes so we're not getting diverted to the outside, I actually find that it is less about objectifying and much more about going within. The energetic of pulling inward is actually to be the opposite of what our whole society tends to be, which is about centrifugal force, where we're kind of splattered up against the outside in chaos. And so I guess I have kind of a different take on it in terms of pulling the energies into the center.
Yeah, I totally hear you on that, and this is really how he presented it, but I think what is being thought of there is not what you're referring to of a center of closing eyes and, and going within, and I mean, he would say that is that kind of contemplation that is the beholding, like this kind of opening, but was more of that thing that Gebser talks about with the perspective, where there's you and there's it. And so everything outside of you looking through the eyes in that way becomes objectivized. So I think that's is, but I totally get your point. And there's a great deal to be said for that kind of meditative centering. Let's talk about
I actually would just add on to that when, and I'll be doing a presentation tomorrow, bringing this in, but when we see ourselves as being in the center of story, where all the stories are actually coming to us and we are participants within those stories, that's another dynamic that I think draws upon the term centripetal, but gives it energy of aliveness and participation, and actually carrying ourselves into the future and being a contributor to the future.
Yes. There was this presentation I was trying to keep it manageable in terms of length because it was way too long and I had to keep cutting it back. And it's like, it's sort of like choosing your children, which one you're going to keep and which one you're going to let go. And there is this, there's this whole thing in his philosophy where he talks about that are through, Natura, Natarans, that because our minds and our own sense of consciousness is super sensuous, that it's just like that life force that we see moving through everything, and since that life force in plants has a structured form, that we really are one with everything. And and even had a couple of pictures that I quite love about where when you look at trees and you look at fungi and then you look at the lungs, like they're all done exactly the same way. Or there's that famous one that I think you probably all have seen where it's the cosmos and it's I think the brain cells and they look identical. So so totally there. It was, it's like, okay, come on, you gotta cut this back.